Hello, so this is a feedback video for the June 2017 past paper, the English Language Paper 2, known as the Childhood Paper. In this video I will talk through the two, first this source in this video, and then in a second video I'll cover source B with some feedback and general thoughts about the content of those in terms of the language and the structure and things that you will need or want to talk about as part of your red penning. So we'll begin then with source A, and again actually nobody really looked at the headline here, but if we look at the headline beginning with this rhetorical question, how can my son be a year old already? Of course they're demonstrating their surprise at the passage of time. Actually, now I say that a few people did group that with the rhetorical question later in the text, but I think the subheading here is important, because when we see he's growing up fast, leaving milestones in his wake and tiny parts of me along with them, it's the last half of that sentence there that I think is particularly significant, because it establishes that this is going to be a text with quite a humorous tone. Again, one or two people picked up on that, but not so many. So yes, there's something slightly humorous, slightly self-deprecating about this idea that his son, this one-year-old boy, is somehow damaging to him, the father. Now, another useful point here is the number of continuous verbs that are used, of which there are two in this subheading. You've got growing there, and you've got leaving, which again emphasise the sort of rapid nature of his growth and progress, and indeed the changes that the writer, the father, sees in him at this point in his life. So let's then now turn from that to actually look at the first paragraph of the article itself. So, the first sentence, my son turned 1 last week. Now, you have a sentence there that is sort of almost stripped down, almost bare in its sheer factualness. In fact, you might almost say that it's almost banal. But what it does do is it serves to set up the premise for this article, which is going to be this sort of retrospective examination of the year in his son's life. So, we have that first sentence. The second sentence, the day marked the end of what has been both the longest and shortest year of my life. Now, this is also going to be structurally significant, because it tells us then that there's going to be something almost paradoxical about his relationship with his son in this first year. We'll go through as this article continues, and we'll think about in what ways it seemed longer or shorter. But that, I think, is important, the fact that there are going to be two different strands, two different competing ideas in play. From the instant he was born, it says, it's felt as if my son has always been part of this family. I don't mean that in an obnoxious, heart-eyed, this was always meant to be way. I simply mean that I haven't slept for a year, and I don't really know how time works anymore. Now, the sentence on line 5 there about the heart-eyed, always meant to be thing, again feeds into the humorous tone that we talked about with reference to the subheading there as well. And particularly in terms of things like heart-eyed, there's a reference there to that whole sort of emoji type thing. So this is very much emphasising that this is a modern man, this is a contemporary situation, that he's emphasising through that kind of image there and that allusion. Because of course, you can allude to things in popular culture just as much as you can allude to things in literature. Hence the allusion to the emoji thing there. Now, the next sentence that follows that about not sleeping and not knowing how time works, if the humorous tone hadn't already been established, then this would be starting to sound like something despairing. But actually, because the humorous tone has been established, we start to see that in the kind of hyperbolic way that I think it was intended. What else then? The hyperbole continues. Whole years have passed in some of the afternoons I've spent with him lately. Entire galaxies have been born and thrived and withered and died in the time it's taken him to eat a mouthful of porridge. Again, more hyperbole, more humour. You can look, for example, at the syndetic list there, born and thrive and withered and die, which again just emphasises that hyperbole. You could use that to build in your layers of meaning. And this then links back to, in the second sentence, when we talked about it being both the longest and shortest year, this is where we see the longer aspect being played in. The implication that sometimes just getting the son to perform basic tasks is very time consuming and stressful. And again, the sheer gravity of the language there, born, thrived, withered, died, that metaphor spanning the entire lifespan of a person. So it's actually, I suppose you could argue it's almost personified there as well in that technique. But emphasising the sheer length of time. And yet within that sentence, you go from this extraordinary hyperbolic image of entire galaxies to a mouthful of porridge. So what's also operating here, and what also emphasises that humour, is the bathos, from galaxies to porridge. Let's move on then and look at the second paragraph, which opens with another rhetorical question. How is he won already? Again, which links back and can be grouped with the headline and serves further to emphasise his astonishment that time has passed so quickly, which is then now the second strand of that second sentence we talked about, in the way that there are other aspects of time that seem to have flown so fast. Now, in terms of the structure of the structure of this article as a whole text, it functions in a kind of flashback or an anaphora structure, because it starts off at the point of him being won, and then it returns back in time. It flashes back, and what we then see is not a chronological progression through his son's life back up to date, but rather it's all sort of episodic. It gives us these few choice vignettes, these few choice images from the life of his son. So, how is he won already? First he was born, and so you see we go back, and of course particularly the connective there, the time connective first emphasises that. First he was born, and then I blinked, and now in his place is a little boy who can walk and has teeth and knows how to switch off the television at precisely the most important moment of anything I ever tried to watch. Again, the synthetic list there emphasises the suddenness of this change that has taken place, and the fact that the boy suddenly seems to have gone, as if by magic, from a newborn to something that is quite active. And once again, there's a kind of bathos from being born and him blinking to this idea that the child somehow torments him by turning off his television. Again, bathos then is a technique that's clearly used here. And even some of the terminology, precisely the most important, the way that that's emphasised by that pre-modifying phrase there, precisely the most important moment, again links to the hyperbole, links to the humour, and similarly of anything I ever try to watch, not just the occasional random programme, but the implication that it quantifies it as anything that he ever tries to watch. He goes on then, it's not exactly the most unprecedented development in all of human history. Child gradually gets older, but it's the first time I've seen it close up. It's honestly quite hard to grasp. And again, there's something linking to earlier, there's something sort of self-deprecating here about this idea that he's almost mocking his own difficulties, if you like, in coping with the upbringing of his child. There's also that understatement is not exactly the most unprecedented development. Again, he's saying that actually he should have expected it, but the understatement again, sort of gently self-mocking, gently self-deprecating. And the final simple sentence there is honestly quite hard to grasp. I think perhaps emphasises his sense of bemusement. He continues then, a year ago, still signalling the flashback aspect. And this is a description that many of you focused on very effectively. He was a sleepy ball of scrunched up flesh, but is now determinedly his own person. Now again, the two halves of this sentence rather emphasise the transition that he is observing here, from newborn to own person, to toddler. The metaphor about the sleepy ball of scrunched up flesh was very successfully analysed. Again, it's a slightly ambiguous thing, because flesh we sometimes think of as being something that's perhaps dead, or perhaps talked about in a rather dehumanized way. But again, I think here he's meant to be sort of gently mocking, I think, of his son. I think he is gentle. And the overall effect, I think, is meant to be quite endearing. A sleepy ball of scrunched up flesh. The ball, the scrunched up, the noun there, the adjective there, emphasising the sort of fetal position, that sense of protectiveness perhaps, of his son perhaps being almost defenceless. Similarly, the kind of sleepy thing, I think, perhaps indicates his vulnerability, as perhaps, in a sense, does the flesh. Perhaps that's more what the writer is aiming for when he describes the flesh, that sense of vulnerability. But yes, the juxtaposition, there's a volta halfway through that sentence, but is now determinedly, and then his own person is what's juxtaposed at the end of it, what he has become. The writer continues then, I can see everyone in him, me, my wife, my parents, yet he's already separate from all of us. Now this is interesting, because he's talking in this article about his son growing up, but there is a realisation here when he talks about him being separate, that in a sense children are growing away from their parents almost from birth, and he realises that. Okay, the child will be dependent on him for a good while longer, but nonetheless the child is growing away from him. And I suppose in a sense it's that issue about the child being separate from you that is picked up in the second article, in source B. So there's a point of comparison here. This is accepting of that, whereas the source B writer actually is rather more nostalgic and rather more regretful that her son is growing away from her, all the more because she feels that perhaps she didn't spend the quality time with him, wasn't perhaps as effective a mother as she might have been otherwise. But that's the realisation. He goes on then and describes him. He says he's giddy and silly. He's a show-off. Again, these are qualities that might not seem particularly attractive. They might not even seem particularly endearing. And yet, because of the comedic tone that's already been established, I think that's how we see them. It's part of his recognition that his child is not simply some kind of passive baby, is not some kind of conformist automaton robot, but that he is growing up in a conscious and an independent-minded way. But yes, each of those adjectives, giddy, silly, you've got the noun there, show off, emphasising these different aspects of his character. But once again, in that sentence, there's another volta, albeit one who's irrationally terrified of my dad. Again, the sort of humour that creeps into that. And it's funny because I suppose he... there are a number of these sentences that use this sort of pathetic structure. They start with a claim and then it's turned around. Here you have albeit, which serves as the volta there. In the sentence we looked at previously, it was the word but. The but is now determinedly his own person, so we see you know, that clearly this is part of the sort of comedic agenda that he has and the comedic techniques that he's deploying. So let's continue then. He loves running around, running up to people and waiting for them to twang his lips like a ruler on a table. That sort of simile there, but again, it's very playful, it's very noisy, it's very full of enjoyment of life, and links back to the giddy, silly, show-off aspect before, so he's now elaborating on that idea. When he gets tired and barks gibberish in the middle of the room, he throws his entire body into it, like he's trying to shove the noise up a hill. Again, another sort of simile, that really kind of comically futile image there that he deploys about the sheer irrationality of this child and his childish ways and his childish efforts. There's some good analysis about the idea of him barking gibberish and about the verb phrase and the adverb gibberish that's, or perhaps even the noun, depending on how you choose to analyse it or categorise it. But some good analysis about that, linking to the whole giddy and silly thing and the comedic elements. You could link that potentially if we talked about the sort of the humorously dehumanising thing about the flesh on line 18, then you could link that to the image of the child barking as well. Again, humorous, again, as with most of the rest of this. Now, to move on then to the next paragraph. With every tiny development, it says, every new step he takes, every tooth and sound and reaction that comes along to ambush us, we're confronted with a slightly different child. Now, a few things then to mention. First of all, here you can talk about the anaphora structure of the every development, every new step, every new tooth, emphasizing the sheer multitude of developments that the child is undergoing in this time. You can talk about that. And the syndetic list within that, new tooth and sound and reaction, further emphasizing these developments as well. We're confronted with a slightly different child. Again, all his article is all about growing up. He goes on then. Photos of him taken in the summer seem like dispatches from 1,000,000 years ago. Photos taken of him last week seem like a different boy. Again, another anaphora structure there. The fact that, again, though, it's emphasizing his progression from last summer to last week, emphasizing the changes that are taking place. You have more of these continuous verbs next, like he's blasting ahead as far as he can. You can group that back to the subheading at the very beginning of the text, and of course emphasizing the continuing nature of his change. He's leaving milestone after milestone in his wake, and tiny parts of me along with them. That phrase might seem suddenly familiar to you. Again, you know, in his wake there is a metaphor, isn't it? If you think about a wake is the disturbance in the water left by, for example, a ship. And again, it just links to the idea of his growth, although perhaps in this context, if it talks about blasting ahead, that perhaps might be more rocket-like. I suppose the verb there, I suppose, creates that metaphor of his son taking off, and again, it links to the idea of the child being separate that we identified earlier. Again, you've got that self-deprecating mockery, of course, about the tiny parts of me along with him, the idea that this child is, in a sense, damaging him, or perhaps, you know, finding chinks in his armour, you know, leading him to feel affection, perhaps, that he hadn't felt previously. It continues on then. He'll never again be the tiny baby who nestled in the crook of my arm, suckling on my little finger in the middle of the night while his mum slept. Now, this, I think, groups back to the tiny baby thing, to the ball of flesh thing before, in the sense that there are images in here that are sentimental and quite endearing, and this particularly, I think, is meant to be deliberately emotive. And if you look at the way that he described tiny baby, the adjective tiny clearly emphasizes his vulnerability. The verb nestled again, it links to that sense of security, and you can group that back to the idea of him being the ball of flesh, scrunched up, and we talked about the idea of the fetal position before. And again, the idea of sucking on the little finger with vulnerability there, this idea that the child is seeking food, the image there is quite powerful. But while his mum slept, so talking about a moment of fatness and bonding. Nor will he be the baby amazed by the taste and texture of solid food. Again, he's talking about momentous moments in his childhood, and so again there is, I think perhaps there's a move here. Then the tone seems to become more serious. It goes on then, he says, soon enough he'll stop being the baby who totters over and rests his head on my shoulder. Again, another endearing image. Whenever he gets tired, or laughs uncontrollably whenever I say the word tooth, for reasons I don't think I'll ever work out. Again, it's humorous here. It's the sort of sheer incongruity, the sheer unexpectedness of that thing that actually makes his son laugh, that we're meant to find amusing, and you can group that back to the idea of him crying at his granddad, which is referred to earlier. Again, it's these incongruous details that I think are meant to be humorous, but overall I think there's a general increase in seriousness as we get towards the end of the text. So he continues on, but I've had a year of this and it's okay. The fact that this paragraph starts with that Walter but is clearly significant. It's part of, I think, of the change that we're seeing. And it's okay. In other words, he's coming to accept all these things, ridiculous or not, humorous or not. He's never going to stop changing, and I don't want him to. That, again, groups back to the thing about him being separate, which is referred to earlier. But the important thing here is the acceptance. He accepts here that his child growing up is inevitable, and he seems determined to enjoy it. And that I think, again, is the contrast to text B. This sadness, this constant sense of loss, of time slipping just beyond your grasp, is an important part of this process. So again, he is accepting what the author of source B is not. He's accepting that growing up is inevitable, and making the most of it. The other thing to note is that now he is back to referring to him having had a year of it. So in a sense, if at the beginning of this text it was that analepsis structure, actually I think I may have said anaphora, but analepsis structure, the flashback structure, is what's used at the beginning of this text. It starts with him being one, it travels back in time and looks at episodes from this year. Now he's back to thinking about the present, the child being a year old. So we return back to the present now. So he's aware of it, aware of the fact of his son moving away, and he talks about the constant sense of loss, of time slipping, these kind of rather sad images that we see here, the verb and time slipping, and the way that that's modified beyond your grasp. Again, it all emphasises the sense of loss, but he says it's an important part of the process. Clearly it is. You can't stop time, obviously. He says then he won't realise this, of course. He's got years of unbroken progress ahead of him, where everything will always be new, and he'll keep obliviously brushing away all of the silly old fools who tell him how much he's grown. Suddenly now then, this is new, because now he's starting to look into the future. He's looking at the logical conclusion, if you like, of his acknowledging and accepting his son growing, which is that his son will continue to grow and grow up and away from him. So yes, this text now, structurally, chronologically, is now moving into the future. But there's something pathetic, because on the one hand, he talks about his son's unbroken progress. Everything will always be new, so you have this idea of his son growing into these, this great and optimistic future. But then the bathos hits when he talks about all the silly old fools. So even now, even though overall the tone has, I think, grown in seriousness, he's not able to completely move away from the the elements of humour that do probably overall dominate the tone of this article. One day it'll creep up on him. Years of his life will pass in a moment, and he won't be able to understand where they've gone. In other words, then, he's saying that one day the son will come to the same realization that he has. His son one day will grow up to have this same sense about the passage of time, which he is saying is inevitable. And we have a final volta here for this final paragraph. But it's okay. You can't hoard time. It's all about then acceptance. Acceptance of growing up is what this article is about. The other thing here that's very significant is you have this transition into the second person, the direct address, which we've not seen, I don't think, previously in this article. You can't hoard time, you just have to make the most. So suddenly now he is moving from the personal, talking about his own experiences, to the universal. He is trying to draw this kind of philosophical moral almost, based on his own experiences, that other people can learn from and benefit from. You can't hoard time. You can't stop it. You can't do anything with it other than make the most of it. You can't hoard it. You just have to make the most of what you have. In other words, YOLO is saying, seize the moment. That is his point. And I think, in a sense, there's a kind of emotive, sentimental aspect that creeps in again here at the end. This idea that we should all learn from this. You might argue it's like egotistical that he thinks because he's had a son everybody else can learn from him, but I think sadly we just have to accept that. But particularly the way in which these last two paragraphs sort of dwindle almost to nothing, from 2 lines to a single line, it sort of emphasises the simplicity of this message that he has learned. And that overall, I think, is the thing I would say about this article. So, in my next video, I'll cover text B as well.